Hello and welcome back. I'm Bill Donath, President of Logan County Genealogical and Historical Society. And since we've been having such wonderful winter weather, I thought we would take a look at a couple of historical winter events that happened in this locality. One is called the Deep Snow of 1830 and 31. And in 1830, Logan County didn't exist yet. We were still part of Sangamon County. So we get these stories from History of Logan County, 1911, by Lawrence B. Stringer, and he did an excellent job of collecting first-hand information where he could, and he attended a lot of the old settlers meetings, collecting stories over the years, and a lot of them went into that book. But this is the Deep Snow of 1830-31, so I'll tell you the story as it is in his book. The Deep Snow of the winter of 1830-31, to which reference has already been had, was not only one of the most remarkable meteorological phenomena ever experienced in central Illinois, but it marked a dating point for every antecedent or subsequent event in the history of the early settlers. Before or after the deep snow was a chronological expression, similar to the much later one of before or after the war. The snow began to fall in the latter part of November and continued to fall until it reached a depth of 3 feet or more on the level. Then came a rain with the weather so cold that the rain froze as it fell, forming a crust of ice over this great depth of snow, nearly but not quite strong enough to bear up the weight of a man. And finally, over the crust of ice came a few inches of light snow. The clouds passed away, and the wind came down from the northwest with extraordinary ferocity. For weeks, the mercury was no higher any morning than 12 degrees below zero. The air was filled with flying snow, which blinded your eyes and almost stopped the breath of anyone who attempted to face it. The settlers were all largely from regions to the south of this, and had never experienced anything of this kind, and were wholly unprepared for it. It is not difficult, therefore, to give due credence to the stories of suffering and destitution which its prolonged visitation entailed. When the storm came, it found most of the corn standing in the fields on the stalks. It had been a warm and wet fall, and the settlers had been in no hurry to gather the corn. They were so unprepared for such an extreme season that it became almost impossible in many cases to obtain bread for family use, although amid stacks of wheat and fields of corn. Few had any milling done, and all sorts of devices were used to reduce the little grain that could be dug out of the snow into anything resembling bread. Watermills, few as they were frozen and stopped. Roads were obliterated, and it was used to make new ones in the snow, for the drifts filled them up as fast as they are made. Stock perished for want of sustenance, as also did hogs and poultry in great numbers. Nearly all kinds of game were destroyed, especially the deer, which, being unable to run in the snow, fell an easy prey to the hunter and his dogs. Prairie chickens, with their well-known habits of roosting on the ground, were destroyed by hundreds. Apple and peach trees were invariably killed. Prior to the deep snow, this section was considered the greatest fruit country known, but since the deep snow, it has never recovered its prestige in this regard. In It is also a well-known fact that cotton was grown in what is now Logan County prior to this remarkable weather, but none since. David England, who settled at Sangamon County, close to the present Logan County line, said in 1870, "Previous to 1831, we raised plenty of cotton, without a cultivation. All we wanted, but after the deep snow, there was a change in climate, and it has not been the same since, as every old settler can testify. My father had a cotton gin, which consisted of 2 rollers turned by a handle. Cotton was raised in considerable quantities in the Buckles settlement in the Lake Fork country before the deep snow, as before noted in the chapter on early settlement." Elisha Prim of Sangamon County used to relate that his father built a cotton gin in 1822. He said that from the time the first settlers came into the country until 1831, this was as good cotton country as Georgia. He said that this was attested to by men familiar with cotton growing in the South. Elisha attended the gin built by his father, which was run by horsepower. The people brought cotton to be ginned from all distances up to 20 miles. Sometimes it would accumulate on his hands until he would have as much as 3,000 pounds. The price for ginning was a total of 1 pound in every 8. After the cotton was ginned, it was sold for 12 to 16 2/3 cents per pound, and occasionally higher. But after the deep snow, he said that the seasons appeared to shorten, and cotton was generally bitten by the frost before it had time to mature, and cotton raising was abandoned. John Buckles, during his lifetime, said that though only 9 years of age, he remembered the deep snow quite vividly. He described it as follows: "The snow began falling about Christmas and continued until it was 3 feet deep on the level, and 4 or 6 feet where it drifted. A cold wave following the snow froze the surface into a thick, hard crust, strong enough to bear the weight of a team and sled. Deer and wild turkeys became so tame through desire for food that they ventured near enough to the cabin of the pioneers in some instances to be fed from the door. Before the opening of spring, much wild game was killed by the merciless wolf or perished from starvation. Families not having prepared for such a trying time and being housed only in open-built huts were in many cases frozen to death, while others suffered cruelly from the lack of food. The difficulties and adversities through which the people of that winter passed, and the misery and suffering they underwent, are indescribable and inconceivable. And those who survived it and are yet living recall to memory or speak of it with ghastly recollection of its horrors." Christopher C. Ewing, in writing to the Old Settlers Association about the deep snow, said during the winter we had to hitch 2 to 3 yoke of oxen to a sled to drive out into the field and get some corn for ourselves and the stock, and we would find our trails completely covered up on our return. The snow was 2 or 3 feet deep on a level. Sundogs followed the sun all day, and the weather was bitterly cold. We got through the winter with a lot of poor stock. James Randolph, at the Old Settlers meeting in 1875, said he came to the country with a colony of 50 persons, that they came from a warm country, and the men spent the fall in hunting instead of finishing their cabins, and that only 2 cabins had chimneys when the big snow came. that by spring 49 of the 50 were in the 2 cabins that had chimneys, one having died. That nearly all were sick, they had no doctor, and a number of the settlers became discouraged with the outlook and went home. Samuel Hoblit used to relate that he moved into his new log home, near the present site of Atlanta, the day of the commencement of the deep snow. That the home was somewhat open, not having had it finished yet, and that the snow of that long winter, lasting 80 days without a thaw, continually drifted in, until under the bed it reached the cords, where it became packed and was allowed to remain until spring. So we've got these stories from people who lived through that experience, and they are considered Logan County people. They attended the Old Settlers meetings and told these stories and swapped other kinds of stories as well. We have a record of many of those pioneer meetings. The next severe weather event that happened around this area in central Illinois and across all of Illinois. I did a little research before starting to read these, and many areas in the state experienced the same degree of discomfort during these winter storms. And this one took place about 5 years later after the deep snow, and this one was called the sudden freeze of 1836. We had a day not too long ago where we dropped quite a bit in temperature. I think it was around 50, and it went all the way down to around 20 or something like that. But it was a 20 or 30 degree, maybe 40 degree drop. Well, this one was much worse. This occurred in December, almost 5 years after, or almost 6 years after the deep snow. And again, it comes from the Stringer book, History of Logan County, 1911. About 5 years after the deep snow, or to be exact, on December 20th, 1836. And in 1836, Logan County was still not a county, and not until 1839. We had almost three settlements. We had Middletown, which was settled in 1832, and in 1836, 2 other towns were started, Postville and Mount Pulaski. So we actually had 3 settlements at this point. Another meteorological event occurred in the history of the county, which has likewise not been surpassed since that time. This event was known as the sudden freeze. Rain and sleet had been falling in the early afternoon when, without warning, a strong wind, traveling at the rate of at least 70 miles an hour, accompanied by a deep bellowing sound, with its icy blast, swept over the country, and everything was instantly frozen. The water of the little pools in the roads froze in waves sharp-edged and pointed as the gale had blown them. Chickens, pigs, and other animals were frozen in their tracks. Wagon wheels, ceasing to roll, were frozen to the ground. Men going to their barns or fields in slush and water, a short distance from their houses, returned a few minutes later walking on the ice. Some caught out on horseback were frozen in their saddles. Ice was frozen in streams from 6 inches to a foot thick in a few hours. John Buckles of Mount Pulaski gave the following version of the event during his lifetime. On the morning of the sudden change, it was warm, the atmosphere had been saturated with moisture, and on the ground was a light layer of snow. About noon, rain began to fall for a time, when without a moment's warning, an icy wave swept from the north, freezing everything as it went. Underfoot was a slush of snow and water, but in less time than it takes to write it, the polar blast converted into solid ice. Carter T. Scroggin, who was on the road from a neighboring mill in an old Durbin, a buggy of some sort, was struck by the frigid wind. The top of his Durbin was removed and his horse faced in the opposite direction. Realizing the peril of his situation and knowing that if he did not find shelter immediately, death would claim him, he drove rapidly in search of some friendly cabin, which he found in time to save his life. Those who had the misfortune of being overtaken by this icy terror were unable to find shelter, quickly succumbed, and much stock was numbered among the frozen victims. Christopher C. Ewing of Lawndale, now deceased, reporting this event, said in December of 1836, "Our pioneers experienced another severe change in the atmosphere and lost heavily in their stock and poultry, and in some cases their own lives. The snow had been falling for a day or two when drizzling rain set in, which continued until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, melting the snow and converting it into a thin, mushy ice. Suddenly, there came a mighty rushing wind from the northwest, which roared at a distance like a hurricane and froze everything in its course. The water on the ponds were frozen in waves, and all who were out suffered more or less. As in an hour, the mercury changed from 40 degrees above to 30 degrees below. So it's a 70-degree drop. This severe weather continued 3 days and resulted in much sickness throughout the county. J.T. Hackney, in an old settlers' talk at the annual meeting, recalled the sudden change. The earth was wet from recent rains, said he, when suddenly a cold wind came, which seemed to whiten the earth. 3 of us were caught in the storm, and the ice becoming thicker and thicker, and the cold more intense. We were compelled to stop at the house of Alfred Sams for our safety. Ezekiel Bowman, one of the early sheriffs of the county, used to say that after the sudden freeze, he found frogs frozen with their mouths open, and he believed that the change was so sudden that they didn't have time to close them. John Hepperly of Lincoln illustrated the suddenness and change by saying that it was sudden as a clap of thunder. The father of Abe Blairson had a narrow escape from death at the time, his clothing being frozen on him, and he frozen to the saddle when he arrived at his home. Many cases of subsequent death among the early settlers were due to exposure during this storm, and much sickness followed. James Harvey Hildreth, who died in Mount Pulaski Township in 1858, underwent such an amount of suffering during his sudden change that in after years he rarely cared to refer to it. He came to this county in 1833 and was engaged in cattle trading. At this time he was a stout, rugged young man of about 24 years of age. In December of 1836, he, in company with a young man by the name of Frame, started on horseback for Chicago. On the day of the sudden freeze, they had entered the border of a large prairie in the northern part of the state, and the next timber was many miles distance. It had rained all morning, and the earth was covered with water. They encountered a slough containing so much water they did not like to attempt passing through it. In order to head the slough, they rode some miles in the northeasterly direction, and having crossed it, turned northwest to regain their course. That was about the middle of the afternoon. It suddenly ceased raining, and the cold wave came in all its fury from the northwest, striking them square in the face. They were then out of sight of any human habitation, and their horses became absolutely uncontrollable. They drifted with the wind or across it until dark closed in upon them. The cold becoming more intense, death seemed to be imminent. As a last resort, they decided to kill their horses, take out the entrails, and crawl into the carcass as protection against the cold. They dismounted, killed Frame's horse first, disemboweled it, and both crawled into the carcass as far as they could, and remained there until midnight. The animal heat by this time having been dissipated, they crawled out with the intention of slaughtering Hildreth's horse. In some way, however, they lost the only knife they had and could not find it in the darkness. They then huddled about the living horse until about 4 o'clock in the morning. By that time, Frame had become so benumbed by the cold that he sank into a deep sleep, and while in his stupor, froze to death. Mr. Hildreth, in the meantime, kept from freezing by jumping about. As soon as it was daylight, he mounted his horse and started in search of shelter. In mounting, he dropped his hat, but was afraid to dismount and get it for fear he would not have strength to mount again. Bareheaded, he rode about until he reached the bank of a stream supposed to be the Vermilion River. Seeing a house on the opposite side, he made an outcry which brought the occupant out. This did him little good, for the occupant, whose name turned out to be Benjamin Russ, was one of those inhuman outlaws who were occasionally to be met with in the timber. Russ yelled to Hildreth that he could not do anything. A canoe was lying tied to the opposite shore. He affected to be afraid of the running ice. Hildreth then offered him a large sum if he would cut a tree and let it fall across the stream so that he could cross. Russ refused and directed Hildreth to a grove which he said was 1 mile distant, where he would find a house. He went, but it was 5 miles, and the house proved to be a deserted cabin. He then returned to Russ's house and called out for help and was again refused. He then dismounted, crawled to the bank, found that the ice had closed and was strong enough to bear his weight, and he crawled over. Arriving at the fence, the brutal owner of the place refused to help him. Hildreth tumbled over the fence, crawled to the bank, and laid down near the fire. He was allowed to lie there until 4 o'clock that afternoon, but no assistance was given him either by Russ or his wife. Finally, some hog drovers came along and moved him to another house where he was properly cared for. Afterwards, the settlers of the neighborhood, hearing of the inhumanity of Russ, decided to mete out severe punishment to Russ and his wife, but they had fled the country. Mr. Hildreth always expressed the belief that his offering to pay liberally for cutting down a tree across the river led them to think that he had a large sum of money, and that if by their neglect he perished, they could obtain it all. Mr. Hildreth was conveyed back to the house of his brother in Vermilion County, where all his toes were amputated from both feet, and the bones of all his fingers except one joint of the thumb of his right hand, which enabled him to hold a pen or a drover's whip. His left foot never healed entirely, and nearly 22 years after this misfortune, his leg had to be amputated below the knee. This healed, but his lungs, already diseased, caused his death as before stated. So these were first-hand experiences of people during the big freeze, or the sudden freeze. So although we've been through some tough weather here lately, and it's really tough for what we've experienced the last 20 years or so, but when I was a kid, this was our winters. They were long and a lot of snow and cold. We went outside and played anyway. Bundled up, of course. So there you have it. The weather's been tough, but it could have been worse. We'll see you later.